Welcome to another episode of HSF Conversations. Thank you for joining us today. I have here Mr. Morgan, and we are going to discuss the election. 2 days ago, we had an election. Vice President Harris and previous President Trump, of course, were the two primary candidates, and we learned the election results just pretty early, relatively speaking. They were saying that it could take days, perhaps weeks, some were saying, but the results came in fairly quickly. By the way, I should mention we're recording this on November 7th in the afternoon. And so in terms of what's happening in the broader media, that's the point at which we are recording this. So what we wanted to do is, because the scriptures tell us to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, because we believe strongly that Christ's lordship is for all. It's also for things like politics. It's also for things like elections. It's also for things like government. So we thought it would be good, thought it would be helpful, thought it would be constructive to have a conversation about some of the events that's happened the last several days, and just to talk through those things, to think through those things. One thing I would like to mention is that we had planned to do this irrespective of who won the election, number one. Number two, for my part, in no way am I wanting to be or aiming to be partisan in one way or the other. For my part, and I'll let Mr. Morgan speak for himself, but for my part, I'm simply wanting to respond to what I'm seeing in a manner that I hope is informed by the fruit of the Spirit and by a Christian ethic. Some of the things that we plan to talk about today, and this isn't scripted, it's just a conversation, but some of the things we plan to talk about are things like, what was your election night like? What are the sorts of things you would have been saying had Vice President Harris won? How are you feeling about things right now, and what ought our disposition be as Christians for the next 4 years? What would you add to that in terms of caveats and what we're planning to get into in this conversation?
I think as we kind of go through this, I can, you know, it'll be perhaps apparent my political leanings on that, but I'm wanting to maybe offer some analysis of the election itself and some of the reasons I think it fell out the way that it did. And then also, we've already talked about kind of some recommendations, prescriptions for how we should proceed for the next few years. So, and beyond the next few years, perhaps, but certainly in the immediate future.
Well, I'll start by asking you a question, and that question is this: how did you approach election night? I can tell you what I did in a minute, but how did you approach election night?
Yeah, I like politics. I enjoy keeping an eye on it. I enjoy studying it. I'm not a huge fan of long, drawn out watch parties for elections. Part of it, I think, is that there's so much wrapped up in them, and I have so little control over this at that point. I've already done all that I can do. That the tension of watching, each thing as it comes in can be a little bit. I don't know that it's always helpful. So let's put it that way. But at least for my part, I kind of keep an ear on or eye on the news periodically throughout the evening. And then maybe around 9:30 or 10, after we put all the kids to bed, and I had a couple of things I could work on while I listened on, as well. I put on the Daily Wire's reporting on the election, and I stayed with that until about 1:30, which is much later than I wanted to stay up. But it became clear that things were wrapping up much faster than anyone had anticipated. Although our Senator Marsha Blackburn had said they would be done by midnight. So, I mean, she was thinking it'd be even faster. But so that was kind of my experience. And I was obviously very pleasantly surprised at how smoothly it went and the outcome. I was cautiously optimistic in the lead up to election day, but the 2020 election was so bizarre that it kind of unsettled my sense of exactly what was going on in elections, and I just was I did not know exactly what was going to happen. So, anyway, that was my experience. How about you?
I had probably 6 or 8 different outlets up. I had CNN up. I had MSNBC up. I had Fox up. I had New York Times up. I had Daily Wire up, and I had Politico up. Some people would say that's a bit overkill, and maybe it is. I don't know, but there's an election of this kind happens once every 4 years, and for my part, you know, it seems like some people just gravitate to this station or that station, but for my part, and I try to do this type of thing in my regular life. I don't simply want to go to one source for my information. I really do try to be principled to go to the various sources, just so I can see how different people are reporting on the same type of thing. And while that's true in general, I think it's particularly true in a situation like this. Um, so a lot of these different outlets have things that are streaming analysis is being done, and it's interesting to hear the different levels of analysis going on from different perspectives. I found that helpful. It's also interesting to see who calls what first. I found that Daily Wire was calling things much faster than anyone else. And, there may be good reason for that. But I would say primarily what I've had all those up, and I was switching between all different ones of them. But the two that I found myself watching the most was Daily Wire over here to get a right perspective, and CNN over here to get a left perspective. And then I also was going pretty regularly to the New York Times needle.
Mm-hmm.
They have a needle that either goes this way or goes that way on how the night's going and what's the percentage chance. And of course, that this party or that party or this candidate or that candidate is going to win. And of course, as the night went on, it just kept getting further and further and further over here. Once in a while, not as, like I said, I was listening to the commentary on CNN and Daily Wire most frequently, but then after that, I was also looking at what Fox had to say, and also I was looking at what MSNBC had to say as well, and it was rather informative. I went to bed not at 1:30. I went to bed around 12:15. They hadn't called Pennsylvania at that point, but the commentator on CNN said, "I'm not saying it's impossible that Harris would win the election, but it's highly, highly improbable." And when he said that, I said, "Okay, I'm going to bed. We'll see what happens in the morning." And then I woke up 5 hours later without the alarm, I guess anxious, and immediately looked to see what had happened.
Yeah, I understand that approach to it. I wonder. So, what's your experience? I'll kind of tell you what my experience is and kind of why, at least from my part, I find the Daily Wire so helpful. And maybe, I mean, I could have done others, but I was also kind of half listening and half doing other things. So it wasn't like I was keeping my full attention on it. But, one of my frustrations oftentimes has been with legacy media is that they are less upfront about their ideological background and what their commitments are, but then they also allow that to shape their reporting more heavily. Just strange. You would think they would be the reverse, but that's not actually the case. I don't think. I guess MSNBC would be a little bit different, but that in my experience watching CNN and Fox, even to some degree, is that they're a lot more hesitant to call a particular state, especially if it's going for the Republican candidate. And And even though the Daily Wire was kind of earlier calling them this election, and that was, because it was obviously going favorable for Trump, I thought in 2020 they were still calling them just as early as anyone, but they were also being much more clear that it was not going to go well for Trump. And so I just felt like I got less, it felt like there was less thumb on the scale, as it were, for me. But did you find, as you were looking at each of these, kind of at the same time, that you saw any of that going on, or felt any of that?
I would echo what you're saying. I think I said earlier, Daily Wire was calling it the soonest, but I think that's because they're not leading you along, and they're not saying, well, if this county does that or whatever. They're not speaking of improbable scenarios as if they really could happen. They just tell you up front, here's what it looks like, and here this is how it's going to go.
Okay.
Based on the trends that we're seeing. Whereas, yeah, the legacy media is much more hesitant to do that. I wonder if because they're the legacy media, in the event that they get it wrong, they don't want to have called something too soon. Versus if you're not legacy media, then you're not. You're approaching things from a different perspective.
I think that is some of it, maybe. Although, I mean, it doesn't help the Daily Wire to call one. Let's say, so I'm saying, like in 2020, they're still calling them pretty quickly, and the election's clearly going the opposite direction, or was clear that things were not going well for Trump. So it's not just when Republicans are doing well, but it doesn't do them any favors if they call one and then they have to turn it over. So, and they weren't out just saying, boom, it's definite, but they were being a little bit more direct about the evidence that was coming in. I think that what I was trying to, I think the other thing about it is that there's a structure to it. So the legacy media, or the Daily Wire, they have a live stream that will end whenever they decide to end it, whenever they feel like it's called. But with legacy media, they have to fill 24/7. And so, and they are competing to keep eyeballs on their product to fund their commercials. And so they have every incentive to drag it out as much as possible, because that's got to be some of their highest ratings of the year, or of several years, I'm sure. So, so I think some of it's just the nature of the medium.
With some of these interfaces, depending on which site you're looking at, if a state hasn't gone red or blue, it's gray.
Yeah, right.
But then other interfaces, even all certain legacy media, say websites, they'll shade the thing red, or they'll shade it blue if it's trending in that direction, or maybe not trending is the word I want. But if there's more red presently than there is blue, then they'll shade it red, but they don't do it dark red,
right,
or vice versa. But see, what that doesn't tell you, and this is part of what you're getting at, I think, what that doesn't tell you is if you have a state that right now has more, let's say it has more red than blue, but the county that hasn't been called yet is an urban county,
right,
and that's going to tilt it the other way. See, so if you're, unless they're doing county by county analysis, you as a viewer just see that this is presently looking like it's more red, but you don't know that there's a count coming that's going to be deeply problematic for you if you're going for that side.
Right.
Versus something like Daily Wire, like you're talking about. They see that right now it's shaded red, but they're just telling you these numbers are not good if for this side.
Yeah, right.
Because they know which county is coming.
Yeah.
Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yes, I do think that's, well, I think that's part of it also. I'm just saying legacy media has every incentive to keep people on their website or on their television station for as long as possible.
Yep.
Whereas for the Daily Wire, they're getting about the same advertising no matter how long they go. And so it's just as good for them to get off whenever.
The economic incentive structures are different.
That's what I'm saying.
No, I agree with that point, not affirm that point. I guess I was coming back to your previous point about why is it that the Daily Wire seems so much, it's more direct and maybe a bit quicker.
Yeah.
Because they're just telling you what's happening.
Yeah, and I have my own qualms about even um, the published reporting of the election. So the way we do it is when polls close on the East Coast, we begin reporting. And because the United States is such a large country, there are still several hours before the polls close on the West Coast. So I think that it serves, in some ways, the way that polls do sometimes. It discourages or encourages voting, and so there's this aspect of, let's say, you live in Colorado, and you get the sense when North Carolina comes in, well, the path for Harris has really gotten narrow. Well, you may be incentivized to just stay home or not stand in line for 4 hours because you put off going to the early voting. So those things make me, I don't know. There's a question, I think, to there about whether or not it's profitable for us to advertise and talk about that until all the polls are closed.
Numerous commentators have talked about how countries that are way less sophisticated than ours were able to turn around election results in very quick order.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, we have states that struggle.
Yes.
But part of that may be, you're talking broadly about the idea of incentives. There are incentives, and they're not all good.
Right. Yes.
In a system that's allowed to stagger. And even to this point, I mean, it's 2 days later, and there's, to my knowledge, 2 states that still haven't called the results.
Yeah, and some of that has to do with the laws within the state. So each state governs their own election laws, which I like. That's the constitutional way to do about it. I mean, it preserves our federalist system. So I don't think we need to get a nationalist system in. But that does mean that there's some states that have some, let's say, unusual legal hurdles that they have to go through in their ballot counting. And so I don't think that's prudent. I don't think it's wise, but I also don't live in Arizona.
Sure.
So if that's the way they want to run their state, that's fine. I do think perhaps that if it's the only other issue that's really a problem is with that really delayed counting. That's not a reporting problem. It's a technical problem with the ballot counting. I'm very skeptical about opening it up past election day because that leaves lots of room for manipulating ballots in a bad way, especially if it's a tight race and if that ends up being a swing state. Because if Arizona was a swing state, nobody would care. They could report it 3 months from now, and nobody would care. But because it's so consistently been a swing state, that's part of the reason that it has cropped up, numerous times. But it does give opportunity for manipulation, or even if people aren't acting unethically, it gives the perception of unethical acting. And so I think that's not wise, but again, I don't live in that state.
One point I did want to make is, for the record, I don't frequent all of these outlets because I'm necessarily big fans of all these outlets. But because, whether I like it or not, these various outlets represent sizable constituencies in our nation. So there's a certain kind of person, for example, and more broadly than the election, there are certain kinds of people who simply will not look at Fox. And then there's another type of person who simply will not look at a CNN or an MSNBC. And I think wherever you are on the spectrum, I think that's a problem, because whether I like it or not, the fact is a lot of people are listening to this station or to that station or to this station. And so if I'm going to be informed about what is being fed into the ears of people with whom I'm interacting, I need to know what they're saying and how they're reporting. So I think part of that is just being a responsible steward of the information of your time.
Right.
So I just wanted to make clear, just because I was checking all these places, clearly doesn't mean that I agree with all or even much of what is on those outlets, depending on which one we're talking about. Well, we don't have to spend more time on that particular question if you don't want to. But
well, let's. I was going to say, let's move into thinking a little bit about, and we're not professional politicos or analysts, but how do you read the tea leaves of this election as we're looking at how it came out, and what do you think motivated the voters to go in the particular direction they did, and just kind of give us some analysis of it.
The first thing I would say is that I was surprised. I was surprised by the results. Of course, all that any of us had were the polls and the analysis of the polls, and that's a whole topic into itself. You do have people who are very sure that this side or that side is going to win. And a lot of times those people are speaking from anecdotes and experiences they're having in their own localities, that those things are limited. So I was prepared for the fact that Trump could lose electorally. And I thought that if he won electorally, I didn't dream that he was going to win the popular vote. So that was quite a surprise to me. It does seem to me, you could argue that this is an exception to the rule. You could make that argument. I'm not convinced that it is. What I'm saying is you could argue that this election or this era that we're in is an exception to the rule. I suppose I would say to that, I'll believe it when I see it. I think we have a realignment that's happened of various constituencies, and it's really quite fascinating and in some ways humbling. So the sorts of people that are coming together around the Republican Party presently, it has continuity and profound discontinuity with the people who came around the Republican Party in the 90s, which, by the way, had a certain continuity and discontinuity with the Republican Party of the 80s and going back to the 60s. And this is just the way that party shift happens. Those who came of political age in a given decade, as things change, sometimes struggle with those things. Mm-hmm. And so there are people today, I think, who struggle with the way the Republican Party looks now, that they don't look like they did in the 2000s, the 90s. But similarly, if you go back far enough, there were people who were frustrated with what the Republican Party had become in the 90s, who had come to political age, say in the 70s or the 80s, just depending on where you are. So this is not a new problem. And I would say the same thing with respect to the Democrat, the other side of the aisle as well. You can talk about, old school Democrats who are frustrated at new school Democrats. And I mean, I just finished writing a dissertation on Edmund Burke, 1790s. He writes something about how the new Whigs are very different than the old Whigs. Same party. He was a Whig. He was an old Whig,
right?
Not a new Whig. And so this is not a new problem.
Right.
In terms of, that's a broad statement to say that this is an exception to the rule. I believe it when we see it, because we've got decades and centuries worth of the counterexample of that. Parties shift. They just do. In terms of the coalition that's around the Republican Party right now, because your question was about how do you read the political tea leaves and what's come together? You have people voting according to the exit polls, and they're still doing a lot of analysis. So this could be subject to change, but you've got people who just historically have been Democrat and they are voting Republican. There's been analysis on Black men. There's been analysis on Hispanics. There's been analysis on more involvement from men in general. I saw a news item this morning that talked about a higher percentage of Catholics went for Trump this time than in the past. And so some people are saying perhaps part of that had to do with this Catholic charity a few weeks ago and some of the
Our Smith dinner. Yeah.
That happened around that. You also, though, there are certain old school Democrats who don't like the direction that their party has gone now. And some of them are still voting Democrat, but they're really frustrated with where the party's at.
Right.
But then some of those people have flipped over. On the other hand, you've got certain Republicans who were, say, a big deal in the 90s who have gone over to the other side.
Yeah.
So you've got different people switching sides, and it's just all very fascinating. And the analysis is still being done. But here's, in terms of a takeaway from that, and like I say, some of that is perhaps subject to change as more analysis comes out. But in terms of a takeaway, here's what I remember, or here's what comes to my mind. I find it all very humbling because we all vote according to our own values, the principles that matter to us, whatever the case may be. But we all have the tendency to view the world through our own lens. And we can sometimes think that other people need to view it the way that we are as well. But the reason it's humbling is to remember a political coalition of any kind whatsoever that's successful in a world with a lot of people is going to be a coalition of people who are very, very distinct and who are coming together for different kinds of reasons. And the reason why that's humbling to me is there are a lot of types of people in America who aren't like me. They're not like the people who I think are problematic on our political scene. They're not like that, and so maybe they would vote like I would. But if you put us in a room together, we're actually really, really, really different. And the reason that's humbling is because we as Americans are doing life, as it were, with people who in some ways are very much like us and who in other ways are very much not like us. I guess it's humbling. Because for this, it's not just that the issues that matter to me are the issues that matter to all the other people who might vote in the same way that I would.
Right.
And so just because a given candidate isn't talking about all the things that matter most to me, even if hypothetically he or she is talking about some of the things that matter most to me. And even if a given candidate is saying some things that I don't particularly like, and maybe I even find offensive, I have to remember the fact that a political platform that is successful is going to have to appeal to a broad base of people who have different struggles than I do. And that's humbling because, we're not in the new heavens and new earth where we're just rubbing shoulders with other believers.
Yeah.
We're in America.
The presidential candidacy is more that way than any other elected official in the United States. And I would even say globally, because of the Electoral College's requirement that presidential candidates appeal as broadly as possible to the entire country. That makes it very difficult to run as a president for any candidate, because if they go too extreme in one way or the other, they automatically will cut out huge chunks of the country. And so it's a very difficult process. And this is one of the geniuses of the Electoral College, is it does force, by dint of loss over time, it forces parties to try to appeal to the broadest amount of people possible. They don't just have to aim for 50.0001%. They have to get a broad.
And for people who have high ideals like Christians, that can be hard.
Yeah.
It can be really hard. But while it's appropriate to be idealists in some ways, we have to also be realists. We live in the real world.
Yeah.
So what do you make of the tea leaves? You asked me.
Well, I want to talk about the party realignment for a minute, because that has been on my mind a lot. You're right to point out that there's this constant flux in politics that is constantly going on. It's an organic development over time. I do think that we're living through a particularly volatile change over the last 10 years or so. The 2016 election really was a breaking point in many ways. You had some very prominent leftists, say like Dave Rubin, who worked for the Young Turks, who then shifted political parties and moved into the Republican Party. And there were numerous other political figures or politicos who did the same. And then bizarrely in 2024, you have RFK, Elon Musk,
We're not conservative people.
Tulsi Gabbard, who have been lifelong Democrats. Donald Trump was a Democrat for many years. Now, logistically, in New York City, if he was getting anything done, he had to be pretty open to democratic politics. So, but he would have, has maybe more historically in connection with the Democrat Party of the late 20th century. But they're now all in the Republican camp. And then you had Dick Cheney, of all people, endorsing Kamala Harris. And so it's very strange, the shift that has occurred, that's much more kind of seismic in those shifts. So one of the things that I have been thinking about, and I think what can be very unsettling for, let's say, people of my generation who grew up in the 90s, we were kind of at the end of the Cold War period. And the last really major shift in the political parties in the United States was in the early 20th century, prior to the Cold War. After it's some degree after the First World War, but certainly after the Great Depression, the Republican and Democrat Party kind of took shape, and they stayed that shape, I think largely as a result of their disagreements about the Cold War and how to deal with the Cold War, but also the disagreements about understanding federalism versus national government, and to some degree about the benefits or lack of benefits of socialism or the welfare state. But after the Cold War came to an end, that kind of removed one of these major dividing points, and maybe the defining dividing point. And the war on terror kind of held that together loosely a little bit longer. But once that was kind of losing its steam, then the old issues of contention fell away to some degree, and new issues began to emerge. And I think currently what is driving some of this division is that the culture began to become a more important thing. There were lots of Republicans in the 90s and in the 2000s who were, low taxes, free trade Republicans. And they thought the culture wars were a lost cause and nothing that anybody ought to be involved in, and who cares about the culture? Well, that is not the way the Republican Party works today, or the Democrat Party. Cultures are right at the center of what they're looking at. And then the other interesting shift has been the war hawks have left the Republican Party and moved into the Democrat Party. That is a fascinating shift, because you haven't had real kind of war hawk dominance in the Democrat Party for a very long time. And so that's, I think, why Dick Cheney ends up moving into there, who served in the Nixon administration and in George W. Bush's administration, and was a ultra-right kind of war hawk presence in the Republican Party for decades. And so I think that's part of what's going on. So the Republican Party has become more reservist about war. I think it's incorrect to say they're isolationist. I haven't heard any outright isolationism out of a Republican Party, but a lot more caution about it. And I think that's drawn a lot of these more lefty, kind of what we thought of as lefty in the 90s people and the Democrat Party, into the Republican Party. Part of it's their kind of opposition to war and getting involved. So I find that realignment fascinating, but I think that it also helps us to understand when we're working through, how do I find my political allegiance? It doesn't look the same. It doesn't feel the same. The Republican Party doesn't look and feel like it did when I was growing up, and the Democrat Party doesn't look and feel like it did when I was growing up. And are some of the policies that Trump is promoting very similar to Bill Clinton? And a lot of people have kind of drawn connections between them and their personal lives in some ways. And, in the 90s, Bill Clinton was the complete opponent. But the landscape has completely shifted, and the whole range of political battles that we're fighting have shifted. And the other thing was, in the 90s, it was Bill Clinton or George H.W. Bush, or Bill Clinton and Bob Dole. Well, then you have the decision between these two candidates. Well, then I would, go with Bush or Dole. But if I've given, you know, Trump is holding some of those same positions, but the only other option is something super far left. Well, then this is preferable to that. So it's also a recognition that we're kind of trying to deal with the situation we have, not an idealized political landscape that we wish we could. And of course, that also is, there's some pride in that, assuming that if we got the exact political landscape that I wanted, that would actually be the perfect landscape. I'm sure it'll be not good because I'm not God. So I think that helps us to be a little bit more prudent in our interaction with politics as we go forward and in the present. And I also think the more we can kind of analyze that shift, I think it helps me to feel a little bit more comfortable with some of the changes to the Republican Party that I like, and some of them I don't particularly like, and just understanding why that is the case. And to be flexible going forward, see how things shake out. I also think that actually helps explain why. So some of the interesting kind of analysis is that, a lot of older voters, they love Trump and they have no qualms about voting for Trump. One of the things I've thought is that the Trumpian kind of Republican Party, it has brought in some of the working class emphasis of the Democrat Party of the 1950s and 60s. And it's during that time that you have lots of, especially Southerners, but people who grew up in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s who are Democrat, who eventually got forced into the Republican Party because the Democrat Party moved too far left. But they wanted those things. They just had to give them up to go with it. And so now that kind of is, that get that emphasis back. So it's been I think that it's a very interesting element of what's going on that we need to give a lot more attention to. I think that would also help us to just kind of see what's happening a little bit better and to, and then maybe think about how we're going to move forward. So.
Lots of things I could say in response to that. I'll say two. Number one, there are people there are conservative folks that I know who loved the Republican Party of the 90s and 2000s. And they're very upset and very bothered about the Republican Party of today. There are younger people, and maybe some older, but certainly there are younger people who love the Republican Party of today. And they can be quite critical of the Republican Party of the 90s and 2000s. I wonder if you mentioned prudence. I wonder if a discussion about a hermeneutic of charity is also important. So for the person who's married to the Republicanism, for the person who is married to the Republicanism of the 90s and the 2000s, perhaps they should be more charitable to the Republican Party of today, because in other words, sometimes these things aren't all or nothing. It's give and take. Mm-hmm. And like you said, in some ways, certain things seem better. In other ways, certain things seem worse. But the fact is that times change, cultures change, questions change, things change. And so parties are going to change, emphases are going to change, all kinds of things are going to change. So there's going to be flexibility, use that word. We've got to be prudent. But in terms of our analysis of the shifts, we need to be charitable. It doesn't mean we can't disagree with people. But it's easy to stand afar back and to be hypercritical of this thing. Mm-hmm. Perhaps we need to work on cultivating an empathetic imagination quite a bit more. In other words, if we're not in their shoes, in that situation, really getting into the issues, really trying to understand all of the sociological and political and cultural factors that are going on, if we're not working to get in their shoes to understand all that, then it's perhaps a bit disingenuous to be critical in the way that we can be. But I think the same applies to the other side. So for the person who's really, really excited about the Republican Party of today, who are uber critical of certain decisions that were made in the 2000s and the 90s, perhaps those people need. Perhaps we can all learn charity, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. And realize that it was always a complicated decision.
It's always been a complicated decision.
It's not as though, I don't know. I mean, because George H.W. Bush is kind of the first president that I remember. When you're a kid, it seems like, oh, well, it's clearly cut and dry. But adults who are voting at the time, they have to make complicated decisions. And it's not always obvious. Now, sometimes it's going to be quite easy to say, well, it's easy for me to decide in this particular election. But I sure wish this candidate would have said this instead of that.
Or not said this.
Or not said this instead.
I was talking to a family member of mine, and she said that when she was in school in the 80s, she had a professor in college tell the class that it's oftentimes, perhaps most times, it's not who you vote for, it's who you vote against.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was the 80s.
Yeah.
The reason that's interesting is because a lot of people seem to act as though this issue with problematic candidates is a new problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a new problem at all.
Yeah.
It may be that we're far more aware of the problems,
right,
because of social media and the internet age. So perhaps we're more aware of the problems, or maybe it's harder. Once upon a time, it was harder to really get your head around all the issues just because of the way the information flowed. Right. Those issues were always there. And for the people who were really into politics, like really, really, really into politics in the 80s and 90s, they knew the same sorts of things we know about politicians today, that they were deeply problematic, flawed individuals.
Right. Yes. And,
oftentimes, not always. I'm not trying to stereotype in any responsible way.
Right. And not just
it's not a new challenge that we're having.
Sure. That's right. And I think not to just, celebrate everything about our system of government, but I know there's a lot of complaints about the two-party system, and there are some serious downsides to it. But one of the benefits of the two-party system is that it actually does help us to clarify issues along party lines, and it helps us to kind of suss out what is the more important thing to focus on. Is this more dangerous than this? And so on both the positive and the negative. Whereas a parliamentary system does not allow for that, and it creates a much muddier landscape politically. Now, there are some benefits to the parliamentary system, but perhaps just because of my American background experience, I am not convinced in any way that it is preferable to the two-party system. And in fact, I think it may have some serious downsides. And then it is interesting the way in which we elect our president, that shapes the two-party system as well, in a way that you don't get in a parliamentary system where the prime minister is elected by the legislature. So anyway,
I said I wanted to mention two things. That was the first. The second thing is this. Last time we had a conversation, it was about the book we did for Dr. Pickerelli. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I talked about there was in Mr. Four Lines, you have an ethic of realistic idealism. So we don't forget the ideals,
right?
But we have to be realists about it. We have to live in the real world. And I was making the case that in his way, Dr. Pickerelli, or at least his writings in his unpublished manuscript on philosophy, and political philosophy in particular, lends itself to the same type of ethic. Well, another thing I wanted to mention, just to bring some of that type of reflection into this conversation, you triggered this when you used the word flexible. Mr. Forline's biblical ethics book, he talks about the four basic values: holiness, love, wisdom, and ideals. And he also uses the language of flexible versus inflexible. And he says that holiness is inflexible. Holiness is inflexible. That which is true and good and beautiful is true and good and beautiful, and that which is not. And morality, the objective basis, the universal basis of morality is not a relative thing. It's the same type of thing that Schaeffer talks about, where with Christianity you have antithesis.
Mm-hmm.
There's something that's right and there's something that's wrong. That's holiness. But he says that each of the other three values in the real world has flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
So what love looks like, what the application of holiness through love looks like, is going to vary. It doesn't mean that love is a subjective or relativist value, but it means that in other words, with four lines, you have a respect for circumstance,
Right.
and the fact that circumstance, times, ages, decades, they change. So the way that love looks, the way that wisdom looks, and the way that the pursuit of ideals looks in the real world is flexible. And so I guess what I'm saying is holiness is not flexible. If abortion is wrong, abortion is wrong, abortion is wrong. There's nothing that's going to make it right. Or any issue that you want to bring up. But the way that you love someone who's struggling with this is going to vary and depend according to the circumstances. The way that you pursue wisdom in a given political atmosphere, it has to be flexible.
Yes. So the pursuit of our opposition to abortion is going to adjust based on the particular circumstances of the moment.
That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And I think one of the things that happens for people who get frustrated, and I understand, it's frustrating. Living in a sin-cursed world is a frustrating business. But sometimes I get the feeling that it's as if people think that it's as if the love value and the wisdom value and the ideals value and the pursuit of the ideals is inflexible every bit as much as holiness is inflexible. But Orline says that's not the case. And he was writing that in 1973.
Yeah, well, and it's also just, it's an impractical way of thinking about the world. It's not a realistic way because no one ever does that. So we're always having to make those adjustments. Well, before we move into talking about, where we want to go from here, and I know our time's coming close, I do want to just mention in passing and see if you have any thoughts on this, but it seemed to me that one of the issues that also played into this particular election outcome was the issue of censorship. I think that there were numerous people who decided that they would vote for Donald Trump as president and maybe even split their ticket, although that doesn't seem to have happened as much as we might have expected. But that they voted for him in part because of the rising pressure for censorship on the left. A lot of the kind of cultural odd ducks that have kind of put their allegiance in with the Republican Party, at least momentarily, they are motivated by censorship. Joe Rogan, I think that's more than anything why he ended up pushing for this. And I think that our experience over the last, in some ways you could say 8 years where it's been very explicit, but certainly over the last 4 years with the Biden administration trying to create a ministry of truth, I would say, again, going back to 2016, Trump's willingness to call out the media and its bias and say, you're lying about your bias. You need to at least be upfront about it. The manipulation of the Hunter Biden laptop reporting and then the ability to communicate that online, and that definitely affected the 2020 election in a significant way, and perhaps was enough to sway the vote. I know that this has got all sorts of moral complications with it, but I have been struck by the reporter who in the moment on camera changed what the crowd was chanting about Joe Biden to make it more about the Brandon Brown, this race car driver. People were angry about this because the media was lying to them to their face and trying to tell them that one thing was true when it was clearly not true, which is what propaganda is. And I think that that is a big issue. And there is a line of historical analysis that says that Americans will allow a lot of things, but we won't allow our limitation of our freedom of speech for very long. And that killed the Federalist Party in the Adams-Jefferson administration, or that election. Adams's administration passing laws that censored people's free speech and they were punished for it, that loses him the election and the Federalist Party ceases to exist after that.
That's a deep cut.
It's a deep cut. I'm not done. Elizabeth Barone argues that the abolitionist movement, the radical abolitionist movement, doesn't really gain popular support in the North until in the 1830s, you start to have censorship laws in the South against radical abolitionism, and you get a gag rule in the Senate for not carrying any petitions that have to do with abolition. And that fundamentally alters the contest. The same thing happens again in Woodrow Wilson's administration, where they begin censoring free speech, anything that's critical of the government and going to war. And that turns the tide for the 1920 election. And so I think that that might not be the only explanatory thing, but that is a huge issue. And Christians in particular, we need to be very attentive to this, because especially right now, it's not just a matter of whose ox is getting gored, but right now it's certainly we're on the losing end of that. There's lots of attempts to censor the ability to say what you think and to speak freely about politics, about religion, and it's an important fight to have. And so I think that played into some of this, and I think it motivated some people who otherwise might not have voted. But
this is part of the legacy. This free speech thing is part of the legacy of the anti-federalists, which is part of the legacy, to the extent that you're a Southerner or that you're from the South. That's part of our heritage, going back to the anti-federalists there. And it's not just a question of having the freedom to express what you believe. It's also censorship to not be able to express what actually is true,
right?
And in some cases. So there's been just tons of things. Talking about 2020, there's the Hunter Biden laptop story. You probably know a study rather was done after the fact of all these independents saying, "Do you know anything about this?" And they said, "I never heard of it."
Right.
I never heard of it because it had been suppressed.
Right.
And they said, "Did that impact how you voted, or would you have voted differently if you would have known?" And they said, "I can't say that I wouldn't, and I very well may have voted differently."
That's right.
So there was definitely
6% of them said that they would vote.
That's correct. Now you could argue, well, some of that was buyer's remorse, and maybe it was. We can't say for sure, but that's what they said. That's all you can. But the other part of 2020 is there's been tons and tons of things that's come out about COVID and just all kinds of things surrounding that situation that has turned out to be true, but the information was suppressed and censored as being altered. Now, that's not to say that everything that goes by the name fake news is in fact true.
Right.
It's simply to say there's a lot of things that's being censored that it's not just a question of me expressing my opinion.
Right.
In some cases, it's a question of expressing what is true. The same thing is happening with respect to current transgender debates.
Yeah. Right.
You know, there's real scientific data that's being censored and suppressed in certain academic guilds, communities, even some of our social medias that have algorithms that don't allow you to say certain things. Meanwhile, European countries are saying, wait a second, maybe puberty blockers are a problem and other such things.
Right.
But in America, we've got some problems there. We're censoring the ability of people to speak, and in some cases to speak that which is true.
Yes, that's right. And then the positive manipulation. So we also think Kamala Harris's 60 Minutes interview, where 60 Minutes literally sliced and cut it to make her sound like she was giving an answer that she didn't give. And it's not editing happens all the time. So it's not an editing error or egregious editing. They took an answer from somewhere else and put it in that place so that it sounded like she gave a direct answer to the question. And so I'm just saying we need to be very aware of that. I think that we also need to be very careful about who we trust and be very analytical about the way they deal with it. And particularly the legacy media. I have zero confidence in them.
This seems to be an application of many of the principles that Neil Postman talks about in his books.
Right. Yes, that's right. And there are all these incentives for them. Even if they're not trying to be bad actors, they have all kinds of economic incentives. Um, yeah. Well, we need to finish up. So, what are some thoughts you have about what are we going to do going forward? You know, President Trump won. I think that's great. So I can just kind of go back to my business and not worry about politics for the next 4 years, or however long it takes for another big election to come up, or is there something else that we need to be doing on a daily basis?
So you're saying some people think to themselves, well, my guy won. I don't have to think about it again. Is that the right response? Is that what you're asking? So I've got several things in reply to this that I would say. Number one is this: even if whoever wins, we need to be engaged. Whoever wins, we need to be engaged. Sometimes our guy or our gal loses. Sometimes they win. In either case, we need to be engaged. There are times where I need to take a break. And sometimes I take breaks. Sometimes it just gets to be a bit much, and for your own mental health. You just say, I'm going to take a break for a week or two or three because you just need a rest. And taking, as it were, a Sabbath is a good thing. But Sabbath is one day out of seven, you know. So I do think that whatever's happening, we need to be engaged. Different people's involvement is going to look different depending on God's calling in their lives. But in some way, I think that we need to be engaged because it's part of being a steward of our age, of knowing what's happening, knowing what's going on, being informed. And here's another reason to be informed. One of the reasons for me, I regularly check different news stations because I want to see what different sides are saying. Because if you get into an echo chamber, you get into an echo chamber. And you're talking about your mistrust of legacy media. And that is a genuine problem. I think that a lot of people are responding to fictionalized versions of problems, not real problems, because they've gotten their news from this source or that headline or whatever. And the truth is, the fact is, it's just more complicated than all that. I think that whether we like it or not, Trump is the next president. Historic, by the way, because only one other time in United States history, got to go back to the 1800s, has anyone had two non-consecutive terms. So whether we like it or not, he's president. On the one hand, you have a certain kind of person who never seemed to say anything positive about the man, but only negative. And on the other extreme, you have people who seemingly say only positive things about the man and never negative. I think both positions have problems. I think that to the extent that he does and says things that are good and admirable, let's make a point to say that was good and admirable. And to the extent that he says things that are dumb, et cetera, we need to call that out too. If I'm a person who only says good things about him, then that creates a false impression to those who listen to me.
Right.
And if I'm on the flip side, if I'm a person who says only negative things about him, then that creates a false impression about where I am, at least to certain people. So I think we need to be, as it were, equal opportunity offenders. Things are not going to be as bad. I don't believe things will be as bad as certain people say. And I don't think things are going to be just, great.
Right.
So I think it'll be a mixed bag, and I think we need to call balls and strikes as we see them. I think we need to be humble. So just because we see a thing doesn't mean we have the right interpretation of it necessarily. And this is one of the reasons why it's important for us to have conversations with people who maybe see things differently than we do. If all we ever do is talk in echo chambers, that's very much a problem.
Right. Well, for my part, I think.
Can I say one more thing? Sorry. One more thing I would say. Again, I'll believe this when I see it. But I wish that we as a country could come together and talk about the issues. I believe that a lot of the rhetoric out there is deeply problematic. I'm not saying we all have to agree. We don't agree. What I'm saying is let's talk about the actual issues
Mhm.
rather than going to ad hominem attacks and such and whatnot. So the type of rhetoric that says, and quite literally, there was someone who spoke at a Harris rally a few days before the election who said, "You better vote for her because if you don't, this may be the last election you have a vote in." That and there was someone else. I'm trying to avoid names, but there was someone else in the media who's in a prominent position who said they would be surprised if we're going to start seeing internment camps. Just extreme overwrought rhetoric. Since the election has happened, the most constructive people on the left are saying, we've got to work on our messaging. We're clearly not speaking to the American people. Um, and in fact, I heard someone today say, butter is $7. What is it? Made of gold? In other words, they're in their way, they're trying to relate to actual issues that people are facing. That's a much more constructive thing than the person who says that I live in that if you didn't vote for my side, it's because you're a racist and a bigot and a fascist. And I've seen that language. And some people would say, well, you just can't pay attention to that language. It's hard not to pay attention to that language. In other words, what I'm saying is, yes, you could ignore that language, but the problem is there's a lot of people saying it, and we have to live in the world that we're living in. And the world that we're living in has people in it who say these kind of absurd things. So I just wish that the extreme rhetoric on both sides could calm down.
Right.
And if we could come together to actually talk about the issues as civil human beings.
Right. Yeah, and for their part on the right, not everybody who votes Democrats are communists.
Correct. Yes, it goes both ways, and I'm glad you brought that
Or
up.
represents some sort of radical leftist position. Some people are just convinced of certain policies, and they find the Democrat platform less problematic than the Republican. So, yeah, I'm just realizing that. I mean, just say
to the extent
they are.
To the extent that we can encourage meaningful dialogue with people who are different than us, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I think for my part, and maybe this is because I'm a millennial, but I think the long form podcasts were great for the political candidates who did them, especially Trump and Vance. Harris did not do them, and I think there was a reason she didn't do them. I hope that in the future we will force our candidates to do those on a regular basis, because it puts the lie to false narratives in either direction. The Republican Party can be just as bad about propping up somebody who has no business running as the Democrat Party can be. And we could list off names for a long time on the Republican Party side. But it forces us to it helps to avoid the ad hominem attacks, because now you're forced to actually talk with people. And you can't do ad hominem attacks for 3 hours. So I'm not saying we need to make Joe Rogan the arbiter of all debates going forward. But I do think that if we can get something like that going on a regular basis, and if that becomes the expectation of candidates, I think that's all for the better, just for the country.
The current debate structure is not working.
It's not. And it's designed for the television station system of the 1960s when it's developed.
And we don't have that system anymore.
That whole system is gone.
Because we're in the internet age.
That's right. Which is also one of the reasons that Trump is kind of a campaign genius. He used Twitter to the best ability in 2016. 2024, he went to the podcasts. And that, I think, is why also you see this massive uptick in young Republican voters. That is one of the outcomes that's just fascinating. The number of 18 to 29-year-olds who went for Trump is fascinating. So we've talked about kind of dealing with people charitably already. I think the other thing for me is that there is, for Democrats, some Democrats, there's kind of a woe is me at this moment that all things are going to come to an end. And they believed a lot of that rhetoric that party members were putting forward. On the other side, there's some Republicans who are, and I've even heard some pundits saying this is a generational change. The Republican Party is now fully in command of the federal government. And I think both of those takes are deeply mistaken. And I think that if we want to pursue good politics in the future, it is not feasible to just drop it after every election. Now, to your point, we need to rest. And there are sometimes I will go a significant amount of time just keeping a very light attention on it. Because as Neil Postman said, I've already mentioned him, and amusing ourselves to death, there's a real danger to having all of your attention and energies focused on information that you have no ability to affect change in. And so I don't need to be consumed with what's going on in a place and in a situation in which I personally cannot have an influence on.
Right.
So I need to limit my intake of that. But
it's important to know the issues.
it is important to know the issues and to know what's going on, but not to let my life be consumed by it. And the 24/7 news cycle is not healthy for anyone. And so we should try to limit that, certainly. But the other thing is, I think we need to be actively involved in our local politics, and we need to become more locally involved, especially if you are frustrated with where the Republican Party is today or the Democrat Party. Well, then the best way to affect those changes is to be an active participant in the local party and to give your support to shifting the narrative or shifting the political landscape within your party in your local area, hoping for bigger results in the future. And maybe this is just because of my time, like my age and where I'm at in life, that has become more and more of a concern for me, that we shape our local politics, because what we do in local politics today will shape the election 40 years from now.
Mm.
And so if I don't want the election in 40 years where my kids and grandkids are voting, and it's going to be, I don't want them to have a really bad choice. I would like for them to have some nice choices. So that's one way to do that. And then this is just kind of a reflection that came to me this election that I hadn't thought about. I know what it was like for me to wake up on the day after the election in 2020, and what it was like in 2016, and what it was like. And I know what it was like when I woke up in 2024, which was, I woke up, I had a lot of work to do the next day, but I was excited about the day that was coming. And I was thinking about a lot of the concerns that had been looming kind of in my subconscious for the previous several months and what might be coming. Those burdens were lifted. And I thought about how that feeling is the smallest little glimmer of the day that we have after the second coming of Christ. Mm-hmm. That there are all these burdens that we have been carrying with us that aren't even at the top of our mind, but they weigh our spirits down. And there's going to be a day that will be a real and true day when all of the cares and the concerns and frustrations are going to be lifted. And so I just took that as a moment to reflect on the goodness of the coming of Christ and what I'm looking forward to, and to keep my eyes focused on those eternal things that aren't so wrapped up in the moment, and that's how I prepare myself for these big elections, is I really start grounding myself in the providence of God and thinking about that, because the outcome is significant for our lives. And so I want to be aware that even when things seem to be going wrong, that God is still very much in control, and we have that to look forward to. So that's kind of where I think we ought to head as we go forward. And I think if we keep those things in mind, it also helps us not to become overly celebratory or pessimistic when things change in the vagaries of politics, which is by its very nature always fluctuating.
I think that's a good word. In response to some of those things that you said, doesn't do any good to gloat. You can either have grief the next day, or you can be excited the next day. But throughout the course of our lives, we're going to experience both. Mm-hmm. And wherever we are in it, I think these eternal principles, themes, are important for us to keep in mind. One of the ways that people learn to one way not to deal with the lows that come when you lose is just to completely unplug. Mm-hmm. And I said completely unplug. And that perhaps is something of a defense mechanism to manage your emotions. But I think that's a mistake.
Right.
We have to stay engaged, but we have to recognize it for what it is.
Right.
I have been spending at this phase of my life time in the writings of Middle Earth, Tolkien, and one of the themes that comes out over and over and over again through his writings, whether it's the Silmarillion or Lord of the Rings or other tales related to Middle Earth, there are people and characters who don't want to get involved in the affairs of the world.
Mm.
And Tolkien, through his narrative, is in effect saying there's a lot of pain in getting involved in the affairs of the world, but it's something you have to do.
Right. Yeah.
But, you know, that doesn't mean it's for the faint of heart, and it doesn't mean there's not a better day coming, because there is, indeed, a better day coming. Well, you have anything else you wanted to say?
No, I've enjoyed it.
A good conversation.
Yeah.
And if any of you have anything you'd like to add to the discussion board or the comments underneath, feel free to do that. Thank you very much.